Okay, hello everybody. Welcome back to our class. I will start sharing my screen and then we'll get going here. Um, this lecture is the first one after the midterm, so hopefully those have been graded for you by now. If you have not received a grade or if you have some questions about it, please email me. Yeah, but let's get into it. Today we are talking about the excellent film about ethics and science, Osmosis Jones. Bill Murray's in this thing. Anyway, you know, standard class opening joke applies. Today we are talking about ethical norms governing research with human subjects. This week we're dividing our readings into two for the videos like we always do. Today we're going to talk about what those norms are. In the next video we're going to be talking about the history behind them and all of the dark stories that led up to our decision that we need rules. If I seem a little bit out of it, it's because I've been burning the candle at both ends lately, doing a lot of schoolwork, as we all have been. But let's get into it today. Let's talk about the norms governing research with human subjects. So, in this lecture, we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk about the various stages of drug trials because those are probably one of the most understandable ways in which research ethics with humans comes into play. We're going to talk about the origin and ethics of the placebo. We'll talk about the most important principle we have in research with human subjects, which is informed consent. We'll talk about the basic elements of research on human subjects, specifically in the US. The three principles from the Belmont report, we'll get into the origin of that and what it is in a little bit, and some present ethical questions involving human subjects. So first, the stages of clinical trials. And there are 5 stages, but they start at 0. Stage 0 is subtherapeutic dosages, which are given to humans for the first time. Sometimes this is done in animals, sometimes not beforehand. How that works is different from study to study. Subtherapeutic means that it's not enough to have an actual effect. They just want to make sure that these things aren't poisonous. And is there some danger here? Well, potentially, not always, not usually, but there's enough that people might be worried, so they do a stage 0. Then there's stage 1. This is testing on healthy volunteers to assess the safety of the drug. These are not usually people that have the disease that this drug is going to be helping with. It's usually there, again, to assess the safety of the actual material in whatever injection or pills being given. And there's between 20 and 80 participants in this stage. Then there's stage 2, testing the effectiveness of the actual drug on the disease and testing side effects. And this has between 100 and 300 participants. These participants are usually a little bit more involved in whatever the study is trying to help with. They might have the symptom that's trying to be relieved or the disease that's trying to be fought because you want to study if the drug is actually effective for doing that thing. Then stage 3, and this is what we usually think of when we think of a clinical trial, is randomized studies with control groups. This happens in usually at least 2 rounds, sometimes more, depending on if it gets kicked back to be studied another time. And this has anywhere between 1,000 and 3,000 participants, depending on the study. And a control group for this, and we'll talk about it in a second, are people who are participating in the study, but are not actually being given that treatment because you need to study a group that is not, actually being changed in any way. That's what a control group is. And then phase 4, after the drug has been pushed out to the market, is post-market drug surveillance. This is, following up, making sure that there are no long-term harms, no long-term side effects. And it can be kind of scary to think that, well, that research is being done after it's been pushed out. But there are lots of gates between here and there to make sure that nothing unsafe gets pushed out into the world. But you would never get any kind of new treatments if you had to take a 15-year period to study long-term effects like that. So the placebo, this literally means I will please. Some participants, which is who's in the control group, are given a false or a fake dosage as a way of establishing that control group. This gives you a base of comparison for your data. It makes for better science. Usually the other dose is saline solution, sugar pills, what have you. And this used to be standard practice in medicine. If if there was no treatment available, you would go to the doctor. They'd say, well, I have a treatment. They'll, give you some sugar pills or something, and you'd usually end up feeling better. And another way that this actually still works is that the more confident your medical practitioner is, the more confident you are in the results. We see this even with surgeons today expressing more confidence in a surgery before they perform the surgery on you. You are more likely to believe that that surgery is going to help you. And so, because you believe it's going to help you, you feel better afterwards. Yeah, that seems fairly ethical. And then there's kind of a good question here, which is it okay to lie if it helps your patient? An example I would give you is I had a neighbor back when I lived in the Northwoods who contracted Lyme's disease. And she went to every standard medical practitioner she could, and none of those treatments were effective for her Lyme's disease. Then she went to without providing any cultural details here, a non-standard, uh, non-scientific form of medicine, and she feels better after receiving that treatment. And she knows in her head it's, probably placebo and probably there's no actual medical treatment being given here, but she still feels better. And isn't that what's important? If you're the patient, you want your symptoms to go away. And so is that ethical? In some cases, yes. Some cases, no. It kind of depends on the situation, right? Moving on. So the importance of consent, and really it should say informed consent here, because you can say, oh, I agree to get that shot, but if you're not given all of the information, how much consent have you really given? Informed consent is, and this is from our textbook, the most important aspect of clinical trials and scientific research on humans in general. If I were you, I'd remember that for a quiz. Historically speaking, and we can even reflect on some of our previous readings, this has not always been the case. And in fact, it is somewhat new in terms of the history of medical research. We'll get into more of that in the next video, but even thinking back to, we did some readings on MK Ultra where people were experimented on without knowing that they were experimented on. Today, we would say that is unethical. And at the time that it was being investigated by the government, they also said it was unethical. The irony being that it was the government investigating itself for those horrific acts. Most of the examples of medical misconduct we can point to involve some issues of consent, either patients not being informed that the treatment they were being given is substandard, or not being given full information on something that had been done to them, like a surgery that went wrong and nobody told them. And then what makes for informed consent? Well, there's issues involving coercion, people who feel like they need to participate in this or that trial because they might die otherwise, or they're told that their disease isn't fully healed and they need to participate in this trial to get it fully healed, even though that might not quite be true. And there's issues of compensation. How much compensation is too much when somebody is participating in your trial? If you offer too much money to outweigh some really high risks, well, you're going to get people from desperate situations participating in your trial because they need a paycheck. And then information. How much information is important to give? We'll get into that again in another minute here, but to keep your participants as informed as possible, because since you're doing an experiment, you might not know the full extent of the risks, so you need to give every piece of information you can. I'm covering up my title here. Basic elements of research on human subjects in the US. So these are named in our textbooks, and they're pretty simple. What you want to do is minimize participant risk, making sure that you are not doing anything that is harmful beyond reason, or really nothing that you know is going to be harmful, or anything that you worry might be harmful. And then assuring that remaining risks are proportional to likely benefits. So the riskier your experiment is, the more benefit it needs to provide to society, to your participants, to the people who could potentially benefit from the results. So the riskier your research is, the more important your research needs to be. If you're researching something small, well, then the stakes need to be small. Then informing participants about risks and experimental protocol. Again, sharing every piece of information you have, making sure that people understand it before you start to actually run trials on their bodies. And then requiring free consent of participants. Historically speaking, a lot of experiments had been done on prisoners and they'd not been given full information. That is no longer okay. We've had enough, we've had enough trial and error there that we know that we need to have the full consent of our participants. If the main theme of this lecture is, and I could hammer it home as many times as you'd like me to, consent, consent, consent. Everyone participating in your study needs to consent to what is being done in that study. And then respecting participant privacy through data confidentiality, meaning that when you publish your study or however you decide to deal with your results, people's names are not attached to it. You know, if you want to say results that happen to a particular person, you would give them a nickname or a number, maybe participant 7, something like that. But you wouldn't want, participant David Mack had, this or that symptom, because that's private and that's not something that you want out there in the world, for when you go in for a job interview or when somebody Googles your name. It's just not respectful, and it leads to a lack of credibility on your part as the scientist if you are giving people's public information out. Especially because in certain aspects of the trial phases, these are people who are participating because they have whatever disease it is that you are trying to either prevent or treat. And so you don't want to share people's medical information. All 5 of these elements of research call for a continuing reflection and dialogue on what is ethical in these trials. And this dialogue needs to include researchers who are doing the study, participants in that study, the general public, and everybody else who cares to chip in, because ethics is communal as well as personal. And we'll touch on this again in a second, but I want to highlight there again that the people who are being experimented on deserve a full voice in terms of what is and is not ethical in terms of research on human subjects, because they're the ones being researched on. Moving on. So, the Belmont Report. This is a report that came out from a commission that was investigating the Tuskegee experiments, which we'll get into more next week. I don't want to talk about it too much right now because we will talk about it more in 2 subsequent videos here. But it was a series of experiments that were incredibly unethical right here in the United States. And this report named 3 principles that, if they had been followed, those experiments never would have taken place in the first place. Because what are these principles? First, respect for persons. You treat your participants as valuable people who can make their own decisions, meaning they can leave the study at any time. They need to be fully informed of what's happening so that they can make that decision, and that you're not doing anything to them that is malicious. And a lot of malicious things were done in the Tuskegee experiments. Then beneficence. The welfare of the participant is a goal that you are working towards. You want to make their lives better. What we're not doing is benefiting from the suffering of others. We're not, doing something cruel to one group to benefit another, because that, of course, would be ethically wrong. Even utilitarians would say, well, hold on, that's not the least harm to the least number. That's harm to one group to benefit another. It's not okay. And then finally, justice. And here they're defining justice as the fair distribution of harms and benefits on every level, be that race, class, gender, however else you want to slice it. There are, of course, other definitions of justice. This one is in line with justice as defined by a guy named Rawls, who is a very smart scholar, but his is not the only definition of justice. I tend to prefer Cornel West's version of justice, which is to say that justice is love in public. And in that definition, we might say, okay, well, if justice is love in public, how do I make sure that I am publicly loving the people participating in my study and the people who might benefit from it? I'm going to have to treat them like they matter. And that means, it kind of does eventually circle back to distribution of harms and benefits. But maybe we want to do everything we can to reduce that harm and make sure that there is a level of care involved as we're doing the study, that we're not just, experimenting for the sake of knowledge. We're experimenting to benefit real people. Finally, some present ethical questions for research on human subjects. First one is, who is selected to be a participant? A lot of clinical trials take place in the two-thirds world, or the developing world, as our textbook puts it. I'm not big on the term developing world for a few reasons. I worked with a lot of people from Africa for a while, and what they wouldn't like it when you said developing world or third world, because that implies a hierarchy. And what we should be saying is that, there are countries that live a certain way and countries that live another way, and that one is not better than the other. But developing world implies that there's a sliding scale and that some countries are more developed and therefore better than others. And I'm not big on that. That's a way to exploit people. And that's potentially depending on who you ask, something that's happening with these clinical trials being done in the two-thirds world. That these experiments are done in sub-Saharan Africa or in South America or East Asia, because these are people who are more willing to participate in something because they need the money and because their governments are a little more lax on rules for ethics in drug trials. And I would say that that is a major ethical issue, and our textbook talks about it a little bit. Tied up with that is, what is informed consent, particularly when the population that makes up your participants in the trial are not educated in a way that would matter for reading the materials you've put out. There was one example we were given where it was a woman in India who had already been cured of her cancer, but because she and her son couldn't properly deal with the information in the forms they were given, thought that she needed to further participate in this study to get the rest of her cancer cured. And I believe she ended up having some complications because of that. We would say that is an unethical thing. So how do you make sure that people are informed? Who is explaining something to them? How are you getting that information to them? That matters. A big question, and this will be our discussion question for the week, see in the next video for that. Is it ethical to infect healthy people as part of a study? And this, I think, is a very interesting question, because it might depend on the amount of risk you're given, right? Using COVID-19 vaccines as an example, if I had been given the opportunity to participate in a COVID-19 vaccine study, I would say, yeah, it's okay, infect me, but I'm healthy enough that I would probably be okay. The risk to me is quite low. But what about the risk to other people? And this circles back to our question of who's selected to be a participant. And is it always people for whom participation is low risk? Well, historically speaking, that has not been the case. And finally, who decides what is and is not ethical treatment of research participants? Like I said previously, who is given a voice there really matters. And you would probably want the people who are the research participants to have quite a lot of say in what is and is not ethical treatment of their bodies. But I guess it is open-ended, because you do want to include the voices of the public, the voices of experts, making sure that those experts have a good ethical base, which, as we'll see in the next video, hasn't always happened. A final thought, and this is what I'll leave you with. Questions of medical ethics contribute a lot to the philosophical study of ethics. They offer real-world questions that keep the field of ethics focused on practice rather than theory. So, even if you're like me and you're not going to be conducting any kind of scientific research on human subjects, these are good questions to ask because they involve real people. And too often, especially in the terms of modern philosophy, ethics has become a little bit too abstract. It hasn't involved any real world situations where there are actual stakes. And medical ethics, there's always a real case that's being examined. And so that grounds ethics quite well. That's all I have for you for this video. I will see you as I record the next one. I'll be participating in your discussion posts this week. And yeah, I'll see you guys around. Hope you're having a great day. Hope you're staying safe.